The moment I saw the fear in his eyes, I knew everything had finally caught up to him. He was standing in the boardroom, my boardroom, hands trembling slightly as the truth began to unfold piece by piece. The same man who had once looked down on me across a dinner table now couldn't even meet my gaze. And my daughter, my own daughter, sat frozen, realizing the life she thought she knew had been built on lies she never questioned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, silence was louder than anything I could have said. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal. And if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one. So many people had written about being underestimated by their own families, about being dismissed, overlooked, even disrespected by the very people they loved the most. And I thought, maybe it's time I finally tell my story. Because what happened to me didn't just break my heart, it changed the way I see people forever. I've never been the kind of person who needed attention. In fact, I built my entire life avoiding it. While others chased titles and recognition, I focused on building something real, something stable. I started my company from nothing. No investors, no family money, no shortcuts, just long nights, missed holidays, and a level of discipline most people wouldn't understand. And eventually, it paid off. The company grew, quietly at first, then rapidly. Before long, we had offices in multiple cities, hundreds of employees, and a reputation that spoke for itself. But I made one decision early on that would later come back in ways I never expected. I chose to stay invisible. No interviews, no public appearances. My name wasn't on the website. Even internally, very few people knew who the actual owner was. I operated through a trusted executive structure, keeping my identity completely private. Why? Because I wanted control without ego. And more importantly, I wanted to protect my personal life, especially my daughter. She was my world. After her mother passed away when she was young, it was just the two of us. I did everything I could to give her a normal life, despite the success I'd built. She never grew up surrounded by luxury or privilege. I didn't want her to become someone who measured people by money. I wanted her to understand humility, kindness, respect. And for a long time, I thought she did, until she met him. The first time she mentioned him, there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Excitement, yes, but also a kind of admiration that felt different. "Dad, he's ambitious," she told me one evening. "He's driven. He's going places." I smiled, of course. What father wouldn't want his daughter to be happy? But something about the way she said it stayed with me. A few weeks later, I met him, and that's when everything shifted. He walked into my home with confidence, too much confidence, the kind that isn't earned but performed. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were already scanning the room, assessing, judging. I've spent decades reading people. It's part of what made me successful. And in that first 5 minutes, I knew. He didn't respect me. Not really. It wasn't anything obvious. He was polite enough, said all the right things, but there was a subtle tone beneath his words, a quiet dismissal, like he had already decided who I was, and more importantly, who I wasn't. At dinner, he talked about his career nonstop, his goals, his future, the kind of lifestyle he wanted. But not once did he ask about me. Not what I did, not how I built my life, nothing. And my daughter? She didn't notice. Or maybe she chose not to. "Dad, what do you think?" she asked later that night, her eyes hopeful. I paused, because the truth would have hurt her. "He seems ambitious," I said carefully. She smiled, satisfied with that answer, but deep down, something didn't sit right. Months passed, and their relationship moved quickly, too quickly. Before I knew it, they were talking about marriage, and that's when the cracks started to show. He began visiting more often, staying longer, and slowly, almost subtly, his behavior changed. The polite mask started slipping. Comments here and there, small at first. Must be nice not having to worry about money. I mean, I can't imagine just living like this without real pressure. Little things, but they added up, because he had no idea who I really was. And I didn't correct him. Why? Because I wanted to see who he truly was, without influence, without power changing his behavior. I wanted to know if he respected people or just their status. And what I discovered was something I wasn't prepared for. The day he proposed, my daughter was glowing, happier than I had ever seen her. And for her, I said yes. I gave them my blessing, but not without a quiet decision in my mind. I would keep watching. The wedding was beautiful, simple, just like she wanted. And as I stood there, watching her walk down the aisle, I made a promise to myself. No matter what happens, I will protect her, even if it means letting her learn the truth the hard way. After the marriage, things changed faster than I expected. He became more comfortable, more outspoken, more revealing. And then one evening during dinner, he said something that made the entire room go silent. Something that told me this wasn't just arrogance. This was something much deeper, something dangerous. He leaned back in his chair, smirked slightly, and said, "You know, I've always believed some people are just meant to stay average. Not everyone has what it takes to rise." And then he looked directly at me. That was the moment I realized he didn't just underestimate me. He had already decided I was beneath him. And my daughter? She didn't say a word. That night, I didn't sleep, because for the first time, I wasn't just worried about her happiness. I was worried about her future. And I had no idea that the man sitting at my table would soon walk into my company and unknowingly straight into my world. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had work to do, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying that moment at the dinner table. You know, I've always believed some people are just meant to stay average. The way he said it, the way he looked at me, it wasn't just arrogance, it was belief. And belief like that doesn't come from nowhere. Over the years, I had encountered hundreds of men like him in business, people who confuse confidence with superiority. The difference is subtle, but dangerous. Confidence builds, superiority destroys. And what concerned me most wasn't his attitude toward me. It was what that attitude would eventually do to my daughter. A week later, she came over alone. That rarely happened anymore. We sat in the living room, the same place where she used to do her homework as a child. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then she spoke. "Dad, he's thinking of switching companies." I stayed quiet. "His current job isn't challenging enough," she continued. "He says he deserves more, a leadership role, something bigger." Of course he did. "What kind of role?" I asked calmly. "Something executive level," she said. "Maybe a director position or higher." Higher. I almost smiled at that, because people who truly understand leadership don't chase titles. They earn responsibility. He's been applying to a few companies, big ones. And then she mentioned the name of one of them, my company. For a brief second, time slowed. Not because I was surprised, but because I knew exactly what this meant. Out of all the companies he could have chosen, he had unknowingly set his sights on mine. "And what do you think?" I asked. She hesitated. "I think he deserves a chance." Of course she did. She loved him, and love has a way of blinding even the smartest people. That night, I sat alone in my office, not at home, but at headquarters, the place no one connected to me, the place where decisions were made quietly and executed without question. I pulled up the recruitment pipeline, and there it was, his name. He had applied for a senior management role, not entry level, not mid-tier, straight to leadership. Ambitious or delusional, maybe both. I opened his profile. Impressive on the surface, strong language, confident tone, but experience? Average, at best. What stood out more wasn't what was on the resume, it was what wasn't. No long-term commitments, no evidence of building anything from the ground up, just a pattern of moving from one opportunity to the next, always chasing something bigger, faster, without earning it. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time, I faced a decision that wasn't just business, it was personal. I could have rejected his application immediately, no questions asked, no consequences. But something stopped me, because this was an opportunity, not for revenge, but for truth. If I denied him now, he would never understand why. He would blame the system, blame the competition, blame everything except himself. But if I let him in, if I gave him exactly what he thought he deserved, then sooner or later he would reveal who he really was, not just to me, but to everyone, and more importantly, to my daughter. So I made a decision, a calculated one. I approved him to the next stage. The interviews were scheduled over the next 2 weeks, panel-based, structured, objective, at least on the surface. I didn't attend them personally. That would have raised questions, but I observed everything, every response, every reaction, every subtle detail others might miss. And just like I expected, he performed well. Not exceptional, but confident enough to convince people who didn't look deeper. He knew how to speak, how to present himself, how to create the illusion of capability. But there were cracks, small ones, the kind only experience can spot. Moments where his answers lacked depth, where he deflected responsibility, where he spoke about leadership, but never about accountability. Still, the panel recommended him. Strong potential, confident communicator, leadership presence. Words I'd heard many times before, and words that had misled many companies before mine. I signed off on the final stage, the executive review. This time, I would be involved. The day of the meeting arrived quietly. No announcements, no special preparation, just another scheduled evaluation. At least, that's what he believed. He walked into that building that morning with the same confidence I'd seen the first day I met him, unaware, completely unaware of whose world he had just entered. I watched through the internal feed as he checked in at reception, calm, composed, even slightly impatient, as if the company needed him more than he needed it. Interesting. The meeting room was set, the executives were seated, and I remained behind the glass, invisible, listening. He introduced himself with confidence, spoke about his vision, his goals, his expectations, and then he said something that made the entire room shift. "I'm not here to grow slowly. I believe in fast impact. I expect to move up quickly based on performance." One of the executives leaned forward. "And what does performance mean to you?" He smiled. "Results, authority, influence. Authority before responsibility." That told me everything. The meeting continued. Questions were asked, answers were given, and with every minute, the picture became clearer. He didn't want to build, he wanted to control. But the final moment, the one that sealed everything, came unexpectedly. One of the senior board members asked a simple question. "Tell us about a time you failed and what you learned from it." He paused, just for a second, but it was enough. And then he said, "I don't really see failure as something I experience often. I usually make the right decisions." Silence. Not confidence, not strength, but ego. Unfiltered, unaware. Behind the glass, I nodded slowly, because now there was no doubt left. The meeting ended shortly after, and the decision? It was mine. I could stop it there, end everything before it even began, protect my company, protect my daughter. But I didn't, because sometimes the most important lessons can't be told. They have to be experienced. So I did something that would change everything. Something that would set the stage for the moment I saw fear in his eyes. I approved him, not just for the role, but for something even bigger. And as he walked out of that building, shaking hands, believing he had earned his place, he had no idea that he had just stepped into a position where every move he made would bring him closer to a truth he was never prepared to face. And the worst part? He wasn't the only one who would be affected, because the next phase of this story would test not just him, but my daughter in ways neither of them saw coming. The first day he walked into the company as an employee, I was already there. Not in the open, not in a way anyone would recognize, but watching. There's a certain energy people carry when they believe they've made it. You can see it in how they walk, how they speak, how they look at others. And as he stepped through those doors, dressed sharply, chin slightly raised, he carried that energy, the kind that says, "I belong above you." He didn't know the people greeting him, didn't know the culture, didn't understand the foundation of what had been built over years, but he acted like he did, like he owned it. And that was the first mistake. I had him placed strategically, not too high, not too low, a position where he had authority over a small team, but still reported to seasoned leaders who wouldn't be easily impressed. It was the perfect environment, not to break him, but to reveal him. The first week was quiet, predictable. He observed, listened, learned just enough to understand the surface. But by the second week, the shift began. It started with small decisions, unnecessary changes, processes that had worked for years suddenly being questioned, not improved, just questioned. "I think we should do this differently. I don't see why it's done this way. I have a better approach." Ideas aren't the problem. In fact, I encourage them. But ideas without understanding, that's where damage begins. His team noticed it first. Of course they did. They were the ones living the consequences. I received internal feedback reports, quiet ones, respectful but clear. Frequent changes without full context, limited collaboration, dismissive tone in discussions. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, but consistent, and consistency reveals character. I watched as he began asserting authority more aggressively, not through leadership, but through control. Meetings became one-sided, decisions became faster, and input from others gradually ignored. One afternoon, I listened in on a team meeting. He stood at the front, explaining a new strategy, confident, certain. Halfway through, one of the senior team members spoke up, respectfully, calmly. Have we considered the long-term impact of this approach? A simple question, a reasonable one, but his reaction was immediate. I think we're overcomplicating things, he replied. Sometimes people resist change because they're comfortable. The room went quiet, not because he was right, but because of how he said it. That wasn't leadership, that was dismissal. And in that moment, I saw something important. He didn't just want to lead, he needed to feel superior. By the third week, the results started showing, not in success, but in strain. Deadlines slipped, communication broke down, and morale, it dropped. People stopped speaking up, stopped contributing, not because they didn't care, but because they knew it wouldn't matter. And still, he remained confident, because in his mind, he was doing everything right. At home, things were different, at least on the surface. My daughter would call me occasionally, tell me how proud she was, how excited he was about his new role. "He's finally where he belongs, Dad," she said once. I paused, because the truth was something she wasn't ready to hear. "I'm glad he's happy," I replied. But even through her voice, I sensed something else, something subtle, uncertainty. A few days later, I saw her in person. She came by for dinner again, but this time, she wasn't glowing. She was quieter, more reserved. "How's everything?" I asked gently. She hesitated, just for a moment. "It's good, just busy." Busy, that word again. People often use it to hide what they're not ready to say. I didn't push, not yet, because I knew the truth was already unfolding. Back at the company, the situation escalated. A major project, one that had been stable for months, began to unravel, not because of external factors, but because of internal decisions. His decisions. He had overridden key processes, ignored experienced input, and rushed implementation without proper evaluation. The result? Confusion, errors, losses. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to raise attention. And that's when the first formal complaint came in. Not emotional, not exaggerated, just factual. Leadership approach is creating instability. I read it twice, then set it aside, because this was the moment everything began to shift. Not for me, but for him. A performance review was scheduled, routine, standard, but necessary. He walked into that meeting with the same confidence, the same belief, and walked out slightly different. Not broken, not yet, but shaken. Because for the first time, someone had questioned him, directly, professionally, and he didn't like it. That evening, something happened I didn't expect. My daughter called me, late. Her voice was different. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She paused, longer this time. "Do you think people can change?" The question hung in the air, heavy, uncertain. I knew what she was really asking, but I also knew this wasn't a moment for answers. It was a moment for truth to find its way. "I think," I said slowly, "people reveal who they are when they're given the opportunity." Silence. And then a quiet breath. "I just don't know what to think anymore." That was the first crack, not in him, but in her belief. And once that begins, there's no going back. But what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the next step I had planned would accelerate everything. Because up until now, he had only been tested at the surface. What I was about to do next would put him in a position where his true nature could no longer be hidden. A decision that would not only impact his career, but his marriage. And when that moment came, there would be no more assumptions, no more illusions. Only truth and the consequences that follow it. The first day he walked into the company as an employee, I was already there. Not in the open, not in a way anyone would recognize, but watching. There's a certain energy people carry when they believe they've made it. You can see it in how they walk, how they speak, how they look at others. And as he stepped through those doors, dressed sharply, chin slightly raised, he carried that energy, the kind that says, "I belong above you." He didn't know the people greeting him, didn't know the culture, didn't understand the foundation of what had been built over years, but he acted like he did, like he owned it. And that was the first mistake. I had him placed strategically, not too high, not too low, a position where he had authority over a small team, but still reported to seasoned leaders who wouldn't be easily impressed. It was the perfect environment, not to break him, but to reveal him. The first week was quiet, predictable. He observed, listened, learned just enough to understand the surface. But by the second week, the shift began. It started with small decisions, unnecessary changes, processes that had worked for years suddenly being questioned. Not improved, just questioned. "I think we should do this differently. I don't see why it's done this way. I have a better approach." Ideas aren't the problem. In fact, I encourage them. But ideas without understanding, that's where damage begins. His team noticed it first. Of course they did. They were the ones living the consequences. I received internal feedback reports, quiet ones, respectful but clear. Frequent changes without full context, limited collaboration, dismissive tone in discussions. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, but consistent, and consistency reveals character. I watched as he began asserting authority more aggressively, not through leadership, but through control. Meetings became one-sided, decisions became faster, and input from others gradually ignored. One afternoon, I listened in on a team meeting. He stood at the front, explaining a new strategy, confident, certain. Halfway through, one of the senior team members spoke up, respectfully, calmly. "Have we considered the long-term impact of this approach?" A simple question, a reasonable one. But his reaction was immediate. "I think we're overcomplicating things. Sometimes people resist change because they're comfortable." The room went quiet, not because he was right, but because of how he said it. That wasn't leadership, that was dismissal. And in that moment, I saw something important. He didn't just want to lead, he needed to feel superior. By the third week, the results started showing, not in success, but in strain. Deadlines slipped, communication broke down, and morale, it dropped. People stopped speaking up, stopped contributing, not because they didn't care, but because they knew it wouldn't matter. And still, he remained confident, because in his mind, he was doing everything right. At home, things were different, at least on the surface. My daughter would call me occasionally, tell me how proud she was, how excited he was about his new role. "He's finally where he belongs, Dad," she said once. I paused, because the truth was something she wasn't ready to hear. "I'm glad he's happy," I replied. But even through her voice, I sensed something else, something subtle, uncertainty. A few days later, I saw her in person. She came by for dinner again, but this time she wasn't glowing. She was quieter, more reserved. "How's everything?" I asked gently. She hesitated, just for a moment. "It's good," she said, "just busy." Busy, that word again. People often use it to hide what they're not ready to say. I didn't push, not yet, because I knew the truth was already unfolding. Back at the company, the situation escalated. A major project, one that had been stable for months, began to unravel. Not because of external factors, but because of internal decisions, his decisions. He had overridden key processes, ignored experienced input, and rushed implementation without proper evaluation. The result: confusion, errors, losses. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to raise attention, and that's when the first formal complaint came in. Not emotional, not exaggerated, just factual. Leadership approach is creating instability. I read it twice, then set it aside, because this was the moment everything began to shift. Not for me, but for him. A performance review was scheduled, routine, standard, but necessary. He walked into that meeting with the same confidence, the same belief, and walked out slightly different, not broken, not yet, but shaken, because for the first time someone had questioned him, directly, professionally, and he didn't like it. That evening, something happened I didn't expect. My daughter called me, late. Her voice was different. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She paused, longer this time. "Do you think people can change?" The question hung in the air, heavy, uncertain. I knew what she was really asking, but I also knew this wasn't a moment for answers. It was a moment for truth to find its way. "I think," I said slowly, "people reveal who they are when they're given the opportunity." Silence, and then a quiet breath. "I just don't know what to think anymore." That was the first crack, not in him, but in her belief. And once that begins, there's no going back. But what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the next step I had planned would accelerate everything. Because up until now, he had only been tested at the surface. What I was about to do next would put him in a position where his true nature could no longer be hidden. A decision that would not only impact his career, but his marriage. And when that moment came, there would be no more assumptions, no more illusions, only truth, and the consequences that follow it. The next move I made wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was deliberate. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's this. Pressure doesn't create character. It reveals it. And up until now, he hadn't truly been under pressure. Not real pressure. So I created it. A restructuring announcement went out internally. Nothing unusual on the surface, a shift in project leadership, a new initiative that required faster execution, tighter coordination, and higher accountability. And at the center of it, I placed him. He was assigned to lead a high-visibility project, not because he earned it, but because he wanted it. Because people like him don't learn through limitation, they learn through exposure. The project itself wasn't impossible, but it wasn't easy either. It required collaboration across departments, clear communication, strategic thinking, and most importantly, humility. The moment he received the assignment, his reaction was exactly what I expected. Excitement, confidence, validation. Finally, he thought, recognition. I watched as he stepped into the role with intensity. He called meetings immediately, reassigned responsibilities, reworked timelines. But there was one thing missing from everything he did: listening. In his mind, leadership meant direction, not understanding. Within the first few days, friction started building. Different teams had different concerns, different priorities, different realities. But instead of aligning them, he pushed harder. "We don't have time for overthinking," he said in one meeting. "We move fast or we fall behind." Speed without clarity, control without trust, it's a dangerous combination. And the cracks, they started showing almost instantly. One department flagged a resource issue, ignored. Another raised concerns about feasibility, dismissed. A senior analyst tried to offer an alternative approach, cut off mid-sentence. And every time someone challenged him, he took it personally. That's the thing about ego. It doesn't protect you, it blinds you. I monitored everything. Not just the results, but the reactions, the tone, the subtle shifts in behavior. And then something interesting happened. A quiet resistance began forming. Not rebellion, not confrontation, Just withdrawal. People stopped offering ideas, stopped engaging, stopped caring as much, because when effort isn't valued, it disappears. And still, he didn't see it, because from his perspective, everything was moving forward. Deadlines were being chased, tasks were being completed, meetings were being held. But movement is not progress. 2 weeks into the project, the first real issue surfaced, a critical misalignment between two departments, one that should have been caught early, one that could have been avoided if he had listened. Instead, it escalated. Emails turned urgent, meetings turned tense, fingers started pointing, and for the first time, he was losing control. I watched the internal discussion unfold. He tried to assert authority, tried to push decisions through. But this time, the resistance didn't stay quiet. One of the department heads spoke up, firm, calm, unshaken. "This isn't working," she said. "We've raised these concerns before." And there it was. Truth, direct and undeniable. For a moment, he didn't respond, because deep down, he knew. But instead of accepting it, he deflected. "We can't keep slowing down every time someone has doubts." Doubts. He called them doubts. Not insight, not experience, not reality. That single word changed everything. Because in that moment, he didn't just dismiss a concern, he dismissed people. And once that happens, leadership is already lost. The project didn't collapse, not yet, but it began to unravel, slowly. Then, all at once, mistakes multiplied, communication broke down, trust disappeared. And then the report came in. A formal internal escalation, not about the project, but about him. I read every line carefully, every word measured, every statement supported. Lack of collaborative leadership, dismissive communication style, failure to integrate cross-functional input. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't exaggerated, it was factual. And it confirmed everything I already knew. That same evening, my daughter showed up at my door, unannounced. The moment I saw her face, I understood. Something had changed. She stepped inside quietly, sat down, looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to hide anything. "Dad," she said softly, "I think something's wrong." I didn't interrupt, because this was her moment. "He's been different," she continued, stressed, angry, distant. Her voice trembled slightly. "And when I try to talk to him, he just says I don't understand." I felt a weight settle in my chest, because this was no longer about work. It was coming home. "I thought maybe it's just pressure," she said. "Maybe I'm overthinking." No, she wasn't, but I let her speak. "I just don't recognize him sometimes." That sentence, it stayed with me, because the truth is, she was starting to see him, not the version she fell in love with, but the version that had always been there. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I leaned forward slightly, careful with my words. "Pressure doesn't change people," I said quietly. "It shows you who they are." She looked at me, eyes searching, as if part of her already knew, but wasn't ready to accept it. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just his test anymore. It was hers too. And the next step I was about to take would force both of them to face the truth completely. Because the project review was coming, and this time I wouldn't be behind the glass. This time I would be in the room. And when that door closed, everything would change. Not just for him, but for my daughter. because the truth he had avoided, the truth she had ignored, was about to stand right in front of them, and there would be no way to look away. The silence didn't just fill the room, it consumed it. No one moved, no one spoke, not even the sound of breathing felt present anymore, because in a single sentence, everything he believed about his position, his authority, his control collapsed. This company is mine. The words didn't need to be repeated. They echoed on their own. He stared at me, not with anger, not with denial, but with something far more revealing, disbelief. Because in his mind, this wasn't possible. The man he had dismissed across dinner tables, the man he had quietly judged, underestimated, spoken down to, could not be the same man standing in front of him now. But reality doesn't ask for permission. "You," he started, his voice slightly unsteady, "you own—" "Yes," I replied calmly. No raised voice, no emotion, just truth. And that's when it hit him. Not all at once, but in fragments. Every conversation, every assumption, every moment of quiet disrespect replaying in his mind. And then his eyes shifted toward the door where my daughter stood, frozen. Because for her, this wasn't just a professional revelation. It was personal, deeply personal. "Dad," she whispered. That single word carried confusion, shock, betrayal. Not toward him, toward me. And I understood why, because in her eyes, I had been hiding something too. The room was no longer a boardroom. It was something else, a place where truth had arrived without warning. I turned slightly toward her. "I was going to tell you," I said quietly, not as an excuse, but as a fact. Her expression didn't change because timing doesn't soften impact. I didn't think it mattered, and that was the truth. I never defined myself by what I owned, but now it defined everything. He took a step back, just one, but enough, as if distance could somehow restore control. "You knew?" he asked her. His voice was different now, less certain, more searching. She shook her head slowly. "No." And in that moment, something between them shifted, because now they were both standing in the same place, uncertainty, but for very different reasons. I turned my attention back to him, because this was the moment everything had been leading to. "You wanted authority," I said calmly. He said nothing. "You wanted influence. You wanted to move fast, rise quickly," each word landing heavier than the last. "And now you're here." A pause. "In a position where your decisions have consequences." He swallowed, not out of fear, but because for the first time he understood the weight of where he stood. "This isn't about titles. It never was." I glanced briefly at the rest of the room. Everyone here earned their place. Then back to him. "But you?" Another pause. "You assumed yours." That landed because it was true, and truth has a way of cutting deeper than anger ever could. "I worked for this," he said suddenly, defensive, instinctive. "I earned this role." I held his gaze. "No," I replied quietly, and that single word silenced everything again. "You were given an opportunity," I said, "and instead of learning, you tried to dominate." His jaw tightened, because part of him wanted to argue, but another part he knew he couldn't. Leadership isn't about proving you're better. It's about making others better. No reaction, just stillness, because this wasn't a lesson he could deflect. Not anymore. "And when people tried to guide you," I paused, "you dismissed them." The room remained silent because everyone there had seen it, lived it, and now it was being named out loud. I stepped back slightly, giving space, not to comfort him, but to let the truth settle. This project was never just about results. A breath. It was about you. Confusion flickered again because he still didn't fully understand. I wanted to see who you were when it mattered. And now he did. The problem was, so did everyone else. My daughter took a step forward, slow, careful. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but it carried something deeper, hurt. I looked at her. "Because I needed to know something first." She waited, and then I said it. I needed to know if he respected people or just positions. Silence, because now everything connected, every moment, every comment, every look. She turned toward him, and what she saw was no longer the man she believed in. It was the man he had shown himself to be, without knowing who was watching. He started, but stopped, because there was nothing left to say. No explanation could undo what had already been revealed. No apology could erase behavior, and no confidence could hide the truth anymore. The room remained still, because this wasn't just a professional failure. It was something deeper, a collapse of identity. And for my daughter, a collapse of belief. I took one final look at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. "This isn't about punishment," I said quietly. A pause. "It's about consequence." And in that moment, he understood. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel it. And as the weight of everything settled in, as the silence stretched longer than anything he could control, my daughter spoke again, and what she said next would change everything between them, forever. The silence after my words didn't just linger, it tightened, like the air itself had become heavier, harder to breathe. My daughter stood between us now, not physically, but emotionally. She looked at him, and for the first time since I had known her, there was no certainty in her eyes. "Is it true?" she asked softly. A simple question, but not about the company, not about me, about him. He opened his mouth, closed it again, because for once there was no version of the truth he could reshape. "I didn't know," he said finally, and that part was true, but it wasn't the answer she needed. "That's not what I'm asking," she replied, her voice steadier now, stronger. She took a step closer to him. "Is this who you are?" The question hit harder than anything I had said, because it wasn't about failure, it was about identity. And identity can't be defended with confidence. He looked at her, really looked this time, and what he saw was not admiration, not pride, but disappointment, raw and undeniable. "I was trying to do well," he said, his voice quieter now, "to prove myself." But even as he said it, it sounded incomplete, because deep down he knew this wasn't about proving himself, it was about elevating himself at the cost of others. "You didn't just try to do well," she said. She shook her head slowly. "You made people feel small." That landed, because it was no longer a professional critique, it was personal, and it came from the one person whose opinion actually mattered to him. "I didn't mean—" "But you did," she interrupted. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. "Maybe not intentionally," she continued, "but you did it anyway." And that was the truth he couldn't escape. Intent doesn't erase impact. He looked down briefly, then back up. "I can fix this," he said quickly. "I can change. Change isn't something you say," I said calmly. Both of them turned toward me. It's something people see over time. Silence again, because now there were no more arguments left, only reality. My daughter stepped back slightly, creating space, not just physically, emotionally. "I defended you," she said quietly, her voice softer now, but heavier. "I believed in you." He didn't respond, couldn't, because belief, once broken, doesn't come back easily. And the worst part is, she hesitated just for a moment. "I didn't see it." That sentence carried more pain than anything else, because she wasn't just questioning him, she was questioning herself. And that's what betrayal does. It doesn't just hurt you, it makes you doubt your own judgment. "I thought you were confident," she said, a breath. "But you were just arrogant." There it was, the word he had spent his entire life avoiding, now spoken, out loud. And it didn't come from a colleague or a superior. It came from her, the one person he never expected to lose. "I'm still the same person," he said, desperate now. "No," she replied, her voice steady again, clear. "You're finally showing who you've always been." That was it, the moment everything broke, because there was no coming back from that, not quickly, not easily. He stepped forward slightly, as if trying to close the distance. "Please," he said, but she didn't move, didn't respond, because something inside her had shifted, and once that shift happens, there's no undoing it. I watched them both, not as a CEO, not as a judge, but as a father. And what I saw wasn't victory. It was consequence. Real, unavoidable. "This isn't just about work," I said quietly. They both looked at me again. "It never was." A pause. "You brought this into your home." Another pause. "And now it's here." He looked at me, not with anger, not even with resentment, but with something else. Regret. The kind that comes too late. "What happens now?" he asked, finally, not as a man in control, but as someone who had lost it. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth is, there wasn't a simple answer. Not for him, not for them. "This project will be reassigned. Your role will be reviewed. Professional consequences, expected, necessary, but those weren't the ones that mattered most." He nodded slowly, because deep down, he knew that. He turned toward her again, but this time he didn't step forward, because now he understood the distance. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and this time it sounded real. But sometimes real comes too late. She looked at him, not with anger, not with tears, but with clarity. And that was more final than anything else. "I need time," she said, simple but absolute. He nodded, because it was all he could do. And just like that, the room that had once been filled with confidence was now filled with something else entirely. Truth, unfiltered, unavoidable. And as they both stood there, on opposite sides of something that couldn't be undone, I realized something. This was the moment I had seen at the very beginning, the moment where everything caught up. Not because I exposed it, but because they lived it. And the fear I saw in his eyes that day wasn't about losing a job. It was about losing everything else. And as he slowly turned to walk away, without another word, my daughter didn't stop him, because some endings don't need to be announced. They just happen. After he walked out of that room, everything felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, just clearer. There's a strange kind of stillness that follows the truth. Not peace, not relief, but understanding. My daughter didn't move right away. She just stood there, staring at the door he had walked through, as if part of her was still trying to process what had just happened. I didn't rush to her, didn't speak, because some moments need space more than words. After a while, she exhaled slowly, a breath she had probably been holding for longer than she realized. "I feel stupid," she said. The words were quiet, but heavy. I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. She looked at me. "I should have seen it," she continued. "All the signs, they were there." That's the thing about hindsight. It makes everything look obvious. But in the moment, when emotions are involved, clarity isn't that simple. "You saw what you believed," I said calmly. "And what I wanted to believe," she added. I nodded. There was no point in denying it, because belief can be powerful, but it can also be blinding. "I kept making excuses for him," she said, her voice steadier now, more reflective. "When he dismissed people, I told myself he was just confident." A pause. "When he ignored advice, I thought he just trusted himself." Another pause. "And when he spoke down to you," she stopped, "because that part hurt the most." "I told myself you were being too sensitive," she finished quietly. I didn't react, not because it didn't matter, but because this wasn't about blame. It was about understanding. "We all see people through our own lens," I said calmly, "and sometimes that lens protects us from what we're not ready to face." She looked down slightly. "I just didn't think it would go this far." Neither did I. But life doesn't follow expectations. It reveals truths, sometimes gently, sometimes all at once. "I didn't tell you who I was," I said after a moment. Her eyes lifted again. "And that's on me." She frowned slightly. "You were protecting something," she said. "Yes, but I was also testing something." A pause. "And that had consequences too." She didn't respond immediately, because now she was seeing the full picture, not just his actions, but mine as well. "I needed to know if he respected people without knowing what they had," I said. "And now you know," she replied. Yes, now I knew. But knowledge doesn't undo damage, it just explains it. "What happens now?" she asked. The same question he had asked, but her tone was different. Not fearful, just uncertain. I took a moment before answering. "Now you decide what you're willing to accept." She held that thought, because that's what it came down to. Not what he did, not what I revealed, but what she would do next. "I don't think I can look at him the same way again," she said slowly. That was honest, and honesty is where healing begins. "Then don't rush yourself," I said. "Take the time you need to understand what this means for you." She nodded, not because she had answers, but because she understood the question. And sometimes that's enough. Over the next few days, things remained quiet. At the company, his role was officially reassigned. Not dramatically, not publicly, just adjusted. Because this was never about humiliation, it was about accountability. He didn't fight it, didn't argue, didn't push back. And that, more than anything, told me something. Something had shifted. Not fully, not permanently, but something. At home, my daughter kept her distance. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. She needed space to think, to feel, to understand. And I gave her that. because healing can't be forced. It has to happen on its own. A week later, she came to see me again. This time, she looked different. Not broken, not lost, just grounded. "I spoke to him," she said. I listened. "He apologized." I nodded slightly. "And I believe he meant it." That mattered. But it wasn't everything. "I told him I need time," she added. That mattered more, because time reveals consistency, and consistency reveals truth. "I don't know what's going to happen," she admitted. "That's okay," I said. "Not knowing means you're thinking." She smiled slightly, a small one, but real. "I think I understand something now," she said. I waited. "Respect isn't about how someone treats you when things are easy." A pause. "It's about how they treat people when they don't have to." I felt a quiet sense of pride, not because she had learned something, but because she had experienced it. And lessons like that stay. "I guess you were right," she added softly. I shook my head. This wasn't about being right. It was about seeing clearly. And now she did. As for me, I went back to my life, the same way I always had, quiet, structured, focused. But something had changed, not in my work, but in my understanding. Because even after everything I had built, everything I had learned, I was reminded of something simple. You can create success, you can build systems, you can control environments, but you can't control people. They will always show you who they are. The only question is, are you paying attention? And sometimes the hardest part isn't seeing the truth, it's accepting it. So if you've ever trusted someone who turned out to be different than you believed, if you've ever ignored signs because you wanted something to work, you're not alone. But remember this, people don't change under pressure. They reveal themselves. And once they do, it's up to you to decide what happens next.